Imagine a world where your worth was not measured by your intelligence, your kindness, or your dreams, but by things utterly beyond your control. A world where a single misstep, a twist of fate, or even just the way you were born could condemn you to a life of shame and isolation. What if your value as a human being hinged on your body's ability to bear children, or your silence, or the virtue of your reputation in 590? And these were not just hypotheticals. These were the grim realities for countless women. Are you ready to uncover the most crushing social stigmas that shadowed their lives? Number 6. The price of a woman's voice in the year 590, out across the sprawling lands from the frosty shores of Britannia to the sun-drenched markets of Constantinople, a woman's place was largely defined by her quietness, her modesty, and her deference. Her voice, when it was heard, was expected to be soft, agreeable, and never challenging to the established order, especially not to men. For a woman to speak out, to assert herself, or to offer an opinion that deviated from the norm was not merely considered impolite, it was often seen as a dangerous rebellion against the very fabric of society, an act that could lead to devastating social stigmas. This was not about having a strong opinion in private conversation. This was about public demeanor, about challenging authority, or about being perceived as unmanageable or insubordinate. Consider the pervasive influence of religious texts and interpretations at the time. Christian doctrine, which was deeply embedded in the legal codes and social customs of much of Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire, often emphasized female submission. Passages advising women to learn in quietness and full submission and to not teach or assume authority over a man were interpreted very literally and applied with rigorous fervor. A woman who dared contradict her husband, to argue with a male relative, or to voice a public complaint in a manner deemed too assertive or too emotional, was immediately branded. She might be labeled as brazen, loud, contentious, or even worse, unwomanly. These labels were not mere insults. They were condemnations that chipped away at her reputation and her standing in the community. Imagine a woman named Theodora, living in a bustling Byzantine town. She is known for her sharp mind and quick wit, perhaps inherited from her mother. One day, a disagreement arises in the marketplace regarding the price of grain. Theodora, seeing clearly that the merchant is overcharging, speaks up politely at first, but then with increasing firmness as the merchant dismisses her. Her arguments are logical, her facts undeniable, yet as she speaks the whispers begin. "Did you hear her?" someone might murmur. Another might add, "She ought to be at home, spinning, not haggling with men." The merchant, feeling his authority challenged by a woman, might dismiss her, not on the merits of her argument, but on the perceived impropriety of her speaking at all. Theodora might win the small victory of a fairer price, but the damage to her social standing would be immense. Her perceived assertiveness would make her a topic of gossip, painting her as someone difficult, someone who did not know her place. She might find herself excluded from social gatherings. Her daughters might struggle to find suitable husbands, and her own husband might face ridicule for his inability to control his disobedient wife. The social pressure to conform was immense, and the cost of nonconformity was often ostracization. Beyond mere impoliteness, a woman who spoke out too forcefully could be viewed with suspicion. In some regions, particularly those steeped in folk traditions and nascent superstitions, a woman who displayed too much independence or too much intellect could even be accused of witchcraft or of being possessed by malevolent spirits. This was particularly true if her words seemed to defy natural order or challenge male dominance too directly. While the full-blown witch hunts were centuries away, the seeds of suspicion were already present. A woman who was perceived as being too clever or too outspoken could find herself isolated, feared, and even targeted by the community. Her very intellect A quality that today is celebrated was then a potential weapon against her, capable of turning her into an outcast. Historians of the early medieval period often recount the pervasive patriarchal structures that define daily life, emphasizing how deeply ingrained the expectation of female silence and obedience was. The ideal woman was often described in terms of her humility, her industriousness within the domestic sphere, and her gentle demeanor. Any deviation from this idealized image was a social misstep, and the more pronounced the deviation, the more crushing the stigma. Imagine also the legal ramifications, however informal. In many Germanic legal codes prevalent in Western Europe, a woman's testimony in legal matters was often given less weight than a man's, or required male corroboration. If a woman was known for being unruly or prone to speaking out, her word would be further devalued. Her ability to defend herself, to press a claim, or to protect her interests could be severely hampered simply because her manner of speaking did not align with societal expectations. She might be seen as unreliable, emotional, or even deceitful, precisely because she dared to raise her voice in a manner considered unfitting for her sex. This was not a world that encouraged female advocacy or public speaking. It was a world that actively suppressed it. The very education available to women, often limited to domestic skills, basic literacy for religious texts, and household management, reinforced this expectation of a quiet existence. A woman with too much knowledge, particularly of external affairs or philosophy, might be viewed as abnormal or even dangerous. Her knowledge could be seen as an attempt to step outside her prescribed role, to encroach upon male domains. The woman who dared to challenge this societal norm, whether through intellectual curiosity or through outspokenness, would carry the heavy burden of being labeled as unnatural or unfit. She would experience a pervasive sense of being out of step with her community, of being an anomaly, a source of discomfort and disapproval. This stigma was not simply about a momentary scolding. It was a constant, gnawing pressure that could diminish a woman's opportunities, isolate her from her peers, and ultimately restrict her agency and her very sense of self. In a deeply profound way, her identity became inextricably linked with the community's disapproval of her improper speech, a silent sentence whispered through glances and hushed tones, crushing her spirit one day at a time. Number 5. Living with a mark. Physical imperfection. In the early medieval world of 590 AD, where medicine was rudimentary and understanding of the human body limited, physical imperfections were not merely a matter of aesthetics. They were often seen as profound social stigmas, carrying deep spiritual and moral implications. For a woman, a noticeable physical deformity, a chronic illness, or even a distinctive scar could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, a mark of sin, or a curse. This perception created a crushing burden, impacting her marriage prospects, her social acceptance, and her overall standing within the community. The ideal woman was not only virtuous and modest, but also physically wholesome and capable of bearing healthy children. Any deviation from this ideal was scrutinized and judged. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Elara, born with a pronounced limp in a small Frankish village. In an age before widespread medical understanding, her condition might not have been attributed to a birth defect, but rather to a spiritual imbalance or even a punishment for an unknown transgression, either hers or her family's. As she grew, her limp would set her apart. Children might whisper about her. Adults might eye her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Her physical difference would cast a shadow over every aspect of her life. While other girls her age would learn to dance at village festivals, Elara might be sidelined, her movements deemed awkward or even ungraceful. Simple tasks like carrying water or working in the fields, which were essential for a woman's contribution to the household, would be more difficult for her, further highlighting her perceived inadequacy. Marriage, which was almost universally the primary goal for women in this era, would be particularly challenging for Alara. Prospective husband sought a healthy, capable wife who could labor, manage a household, and most importantly, bear strong children. A physical imperfection, especially one that might suggest a lack of robustness or a potential for passing on ailments, severely diminished her desirability. Families negotiating marriages would view her as a less valuable asset, perhaps even a liability. Her dowry, if she had one, might need to be significantly larger to compensate for her perceived shortcomings, or she might be relegated to marrying someone of much lower social standing than her family would ideally desire. Historians studying medieval marriage practices often point to the emphasis on physical health and fertility as paramount considerations, reflecting the harsh realities of life expectancy and the imperative for lineage continuation. Beyond obvious deformities, chronic illnesses could also be devastating. Imagine a woman, perhaps named Ingrid, who suffered from severe and recurring fevers, or persistent skin ailments, or debilitating joint pain. In a time when the causes of such conditions were unknown and treatments were often ineffective, her illness might be seen as a sign of inherent weakness or even a spiritual affliction. If her illness prevented her from performing her duties adequately, she would be seen as a burden. She might be unable to spin wool, weave cloth, prepare meals, or tend to the children with the same energy as her peers. This inability to contribute fully to the household economy would not only bring financial strain, but also social censure. She might be seen as lazy, or even as someone cursed, inviting gossip and isolation. Her husband, if she had one, might be advised by others to seek a more capable partner, or she might find herself ostracized even within her own family. The stigma of physical imperfection could also extend to injuries or scarring. A woman who had suffered a severe burn, for instance, leaving her face disfigured, would carry that mark not just on her skin, but on her social identity. While minor scars were perhaps unremarkable, anything that noticeably altered her appearance, especially her face, could make her an object of pity or even revulsion. Beauty standards, while differing from modern times, still placed value on unblemished skin and symmetry, particularly for marriageability. A visible disfigurement could imply that she was not whole or perfect in the eyes of God or man, making her an undesirable partner and a source of discomfort for those around her. Furthermore, the very act of seeking healing could sometimes reinforce the stigma. While prayers and pilgrimages to saints were common, if a woman's condition persisted, it might be interpreted as a sign that her ailment was too severe, or that she was somehow unworthy of divine intervention. This could lead to a deeper sense of hopelessness and reinforce the idea that her physical state was an unalterable mark of her destiny. The crushing aspect of this stigma lay in its inescapable nature. Unlike a reputation that could potentially be mended through good deeds, a physical mark was a constant visible reminder of her perceived flaw. It was a silent judgment, written on her very body, limiting her choices, diminishing her value in the eyes of her community, and often condemning her to a life of quiet endurance, overshadowed by the weight of her physical burden. Number 4. The burden of being unmarriageable. In 590, a woman's primary, almost singular societal role was to be a wife and mother. Marriage was not merely a romantic ideal, it was the fundamental social and economic institution that structured her life, provided her with protection, status, and a legitimate place within the community. For a woman to remain unmarried, especially past the customary age of marriage, which could be as young as her mid-teens, was to be branded with one of the most crushing social stigmas, unmarriageability. This was not a choice for most women. It was a consequence of circumstance, often leading to a life of precariousness, dependency, and profound social invisibility. The reasons for a woman being deemed unmarriageable were varied, yet each carried its own heavy weight. The most common was a lack of dowry. In many societies of the time, particularly in the Byzantine Empire and among the Germanic kingdoms, A dowry was an essential component of a marriage agreement. It represented the bride's contribution to the new household, a form of financial security, and often a marker of her family's status. A family too poor to provide a sufficient dowry for their daughter effectively left her with no means to attract a suitable husband. Imagine a young woman named Helena from a respectable but impoverished family. Her beauty and character might be beyond reproach, but without the necessary silver, land, or goods to offer a prospective groom, she would find doors closing to her. Suitors from families of equal or higher standing would not consider her, and even those from lower strata might demand an impossible sum. Helena would face the agonizing reality that her very existence without a financial foundation rendered her unworthy of the most basic societal expectation. She would be seen as a drain on her family, a burden rather than a potential asset. Beyond poverty, other factors could contribute to unmarriageability. Physical imperfections, as discussed previously, could make a woman undesirable. A reputation for unchastity, even if unfounded, would utterly destroy her marriage prospects. As a husband sought a pure and virtuous wife, even age was a significant barrier. While women married young, perhaps by 15 or 16, remaining unmarried into her early 20s, could lead to her being considered an old maid. Her fertility would be questioned, and her perceived lack of desirability would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. A woman who had passed her prime marriageable years was seen as a failure. A woman who had somehow missed her purpose. She might be viewed with pity, but more often with a dismissive indifference, as someone outside the normal social order. What was the fate of an unmarriageable woman? Without a husband, she lacked a protector in a society where women often had limited legal rights or independent economic means. She could not own property, inherit fully, or engage in most public life without a male guardian. If she had no male relatives willing or able to support her, her options were dire. She might be forced into a life of servitude, working as a domestic servant for another family, often living in conditions that were barely above destitution. Her labor would be compensated minimally, if at all, and her social status would be incredibly low. She would be dependent always, an outsider, without the respect and security that even the humblest married woman could command within her own household. Alternatively, she might enter a convent if one was available and her family could afford the entrance fee. While providing a structured life and spiritual purpose, this path was often chosen out of necessity rather than vocation for unmarriageable women. It meant renouncing the possibility of a family, a life that was seen as the natural fulfillment of a woman's existence. For those who deeply desired marriage and children, but were denied it by circumstance, entering a convent could be a profound and quiet tragedy. Crushing stigma of unmarriageability was not just about the lack of a husband. It was about the denial of a recognized place in society. An unmarried woman was an anomaly, often viewed as incomplete or even useless. She did not contribute to the continuation of the lineage. She did not establish a new household, and she remained a perpetual dependent. She would often live in the shadow of her married siblings, serving them, caring for their children, and performing domestic duties, but without the authority or respect of a mistress of her own home. Her very existence was a quiet testament to her perceived failure to fulfill the most fundamental expectation placed upon her by her community. This stigma was not one of scandal or shame, but rather of profound social invisibility and insignificance, a slow erosion of her identity and her place in the world. Number 3. The precarious state of widowhood for women in 590. At widowhood, especially at a young age and without the security of adult sons, was a profound social stigma, a precipice from which many could fall into destitution and vulnerability. While a widow was often seen as having a legitimate reason for her status, the reality of her situation was fraught with challenges that could quickly diminish her social standing, economic security, and personal safety. Her identity was so deeply intertwined with her husband's that his death often felt like a loss of her own self, leaving her adrift in a society not designed for independent female existence. In the rigid patriarchal societies of the early medieval period, a woman's legal and economic rights were typically exercised through her husband. He was her protector, her legal representative, and the manager of the household's wealth. When he died, that protective umbrella vanished. Suddenly, a widow might find herself in a bewildering and perilous position. Her legal standing became ambiguous. She might lose control over her property, her children, and even her own person. While some legal traditions, particularly in areas influenced by Roman law, provided some rights to widows, these were often contested or difficult to enforce without male advocates. Germanic laws prevalent in much of Western Europe often saw property revert to the husband's family, leaving the widow with little more than a portion of her dowry if she could reclaim it. Imagine a woman named Gisela, in her early 20s, whose husband, a skilled craftsman, dies suddenly from an illness. They have 2 small children, a daughter and a son who is still an infant. Gisela's world is instantly shattered. Her husband's brothers might immediately lay claim to his tools, his workshop, and even the family home, arguing that these are part of the family's inheritance, not hers. Gisela, without her husband's voice or legal authority, might struggle to assert her rights. She might find herself at the mercy of her in-laws, who could decide her fate, perhaps pressuring her to marry another of their kinsmen to keep the property within the family, or even forcing her to leave with nothing but the clothes on her back. The economic implications were immediate and devastating. Without her husband's income, Gisela must find a way to feed and shelter herself and her children. While she might possess skills in spinning, weaving, or domestic work, these often yielded meager pay and did not offer the financial stability of a male-headed household. If she had no adult sons to take over the family's trade or land, her vulnerability was immense. She might be forced into reliance on charity or work that was beneath her former station, leading to a precipitous decline in her social standing. Her children might be separated from her, sent to live with relatives who saw them as burdens, or even apprenticed out at a very young age. Beyond economic hardship, widows often faced profound social isolation. While a married woman had her place within the network of families and households, a young widow was often viewed with suspicion. If she was beautiful, she might be seen as a target for predatory men, or worse, accused of enticing them. If she was not remarried quickly, especially within her husband's family, her single status could lead to gossip and whispers. Her continued presence without a male head of household could be seen as unsettling, a deviation from the norm. She was no longer a dutiful wife, nor yet a venerable elder. She existed in a liminal space, often seen as a problem to be solved. The alternative for many young widows was remarriage, often quickly and not always by choice. This was frequently orchestrated by her husband's family or her own, driven by the need to secure her protection and property, or to provide for her children. Such marriages were rarely about affection. They were economic and social arrangements. A widow might find herself marrying a man she did not know, perhaps much older or someone less desirable than her first husband, simply to regain a semblance of security and a place within the social order. This was not a stigma of disgrace, but rather a stigma of extreme vulnerability and loss of control, a social quicksand that could swallow a woman whole, leaving her with few choices and a future dictated by the whims of others. Crushing nature of widowhood was the abrupt stripping away of her identity, her security, and her voice, leaving her exposed to the harsh realities of a world unprepared to support women outside the confines of marriage. Number 2. The shadow of unchastity. In the year 590 across the various Christian kingdoms and the Byzantine Empire, the concept of a woman's chastity was not merely a virtue, It was the very cornerstone of her honor, her family's reputation, and her marriageability. Any perceived deviation from strict sexual purity, whether it was premarital relations, adultery, or even merely the appearance of impropriety, cast a devastating shadow over a woman, leading to one of the most crushing social stigmas imaginable. This stigma could destroy her life, her family, and her future, with consequences that were far more severe and public than those faced by men for similar transgressions. From childhood, girls were rigorously educated in the importance of purity. Their virginity before marriage was paramount, as it guaranteed the legitimacy of future heirs and the honor of both their birth family and their prospective husband's family. Marriage ceremonies often implicitly or explicitly involved the public display of a woman's virginity, or at least the societal expectation of it. Any suspicion of premarital sexual activity could immediately render a woman unmarriageable. Imagine a young woman named Clara living in a bustling town in Visigothic Spain. She might have been seen speaking alone with a young man, or perhaps she was caught in a moment of innocent physical affection that was misinterpreted. Even without any actual sexual act, the mere rumor of impropriety could spread like wildfire through the tight-knit community. Once labeled as unchaste or ruined, Clara's prospects for a respectable marriage would vanish. No honorable family would accept her as a bride, for fear of bringing dishonor upon their lineage and uncertainty about the paternity of any future children. Her own family would bear the shame potentially leading to her being disowned or relegated to a life of domestic servitude, with no prospects of her own adultery carried even more severe consequences. For a married woman, engaging in sexual relations outside of her marriage was not just a moral failing. It was a grave crime against her husband, his family, and the social order. The legal codes of the time, whether Roman-influenced or Germanic, often prescribed brutal punishments for adulterous wives. These could range from public shaming, such as having her head shaved and being paraded through the streets, to being confined to a convent, or even in more extreme cases, death. Her husband had the right to divorce her, and she would lose any property rights, her children, and all social standing. Historians of early medieval law frequently cite cases illustrating the extreme disparity in how adultery was treated for men versus women, with male infidelity rarely incurring such devastating public and legal penalties. A man's perceived infidelity might be a private matter, but a woman's was a public scandal that threatened the very structure of the family and inheritance. Consider the ripple effect of this stigma. If a woman was accused of unchastity, even if she was innocent, the mere accusation could lead to devastating outcomes. Her reputation, once tarnished, was nearly impossible to restore. This was a society that operated heavily on honor and shame, and a woman's honor was inextricably linked to her sexual purity. A fallen woman would be shunned by virtuous women, ostracized from social gatherings, and treated with contempt by men. Her family, too, would suffer the indignity, enduring the whispers and glares of their neighbors. Their daughters might also find their marriage prospects diminished, as the stain of one family member's perceived immorality could spread to others. The social control exerted by this stigma was immense. It forced women into a narrow path of behavior where modesty, seclusion, and strict adherence to moral codes were not just encouraged, but enforced through the very real threat of social death. A woman's entire identity and future hinged on her ability to maintain an unimpeachable reputation for purity. The shadow of unchastity was not merely a judgment. It was a life sentence of disgrace, isolation, and often economic ruin, a silent and ever-present threat that compelled women to conform or face an existence devoid of respect and opportunity. It was a societal weapon that could obliterate a woman's standing, leaving her with nowhere to turn and no path to redemption, a crushing weight that could extinguish her very spirit. Number 1. Barrenness, or the failure to produce a male heir. In the year 590, at perhaps the most crushing social stigma a woman could face, one that penetrated the deepest layers of her personal identity and society worth, was barrenness, or the failure to produce a male heir. In a world utterly dependent on agricultural labor, lineage, and the continuation of family names, a woman's primary, almost sacred duty was procreation. To fail in this regard, especially to not bear a son, was not just a personal sorrow. It was a profound public failure, a source of intense shame that could jeopardize her marriage, her status, and her very acceptance within her community. The entire structure of early medieval society revolved around the family unit and the perpetuation of the male line. Sons were essential for numerous reasons. They inherited land and property, ensuring the family's economic stability. They provided labor for farming, crafts, or warfare. They protected the elderly parents in their old age, and crucially, they carried on the family name and preserved its legacy. For a woman, her value was intrinsically tied to her womb's ability to produce these vital male descendants. If she could not conceive, or if she bore only daughters, her contribution to the family was seen as incomplete or even absent. Imagine a woman named Edith, married for several years to a respected landowner in an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. She longs for children, but no pregnancy comes. Each month that passes without a sign of life within her is a fresh wound. The whispers begin subtly at first from the village women, then from her husband's relatives. Is she cursed? Perhaps she is barren. These are not idle questions. They are accusations. In this era, barrenness was almost universally attributed to the woman, rarely to the man. It was seen as a defect in her, sometimes even as a divine punishment for unknown sins. Edith would endure the sympathetic glances that felt more like pity, and the direct inquiries about her health, all designed to highlight her perceived failure. Her social interactions would become strained, marked by a pervasive sense of inadequacy. If Edith eventually conceived but only bore daughters, her situation might improve slightly, but the pressure would remain immense. While daughters were valuable for domestic labor and could be married off to form alliances, they did not secure the family's future in the same way a son did. Her husband's family would anxiously await a male heir, and if none arrived after several daughters, her position would again become precarious. Her husband might face pressure from his relatives to set her aside, or even to take another wife to ensure the continuation of his lineage. Polygamy, though diminishing in Christianized areas, was still a possibility in some regions, or a husband might seek an annulment on grounds of her barrenness, or simply take a concubine in the desperate hope of siring a son. The consequences for a barren woman could be devastating. She might be sent back to her birth family in disgrace, a living testament to her failure. This would not only shame her, but also her parents and siblings, who would then have the burden of supporting her without the usual social or economic benefits of a married daughter. Her dowry, if one was given, might be forfeit, leaving her with nothing. In some stricter societies, divorce was possible on grounds of barrenness, leaving her vulnerable and without status. She would be denied the joys of motherhood, a role that was considered the ultimate fulfillment for a woman. Her very identity, stripped of its primary purpose, would be shattered. Beyond the personal tragedy, the stigma of barrenness had profound implications for a woman's status within her household. She might be treated with less respect by her husband, his family, and even the household servants. Her voice might carry less authority, her opinions dismissed, because she had not fulfilled her most essential duty. She might become an object of pity, but often one tinged with scorn, as someone who had failed to secure the family's future. Historians describe how genealogies and records of the period meticulously tracked male lines, highlighting the importance of sons and the perceived failure when they were absent. The crushing nature of this stigma lay in its biological finality and its public humiliation. It was a judgment not just on her character, but on her very body. a mark that she was incomplete or flawed in the most fundamental way. It was an inescapable burden that followed her every day, a silent accusation that she had failed in the most crucial aspect of a woman's existence in 590. For a woman, barrenness, or the failure to produce a male heir, was not just a personal disappointment. It was a social death sentence, stripping her of her purpose, her dignity, and her place in the world.